you can look at it this way. This still history is a mirror. Like if you treat history from a modern science perspective, then yes, you can definitely keep this impassionate element. Let's say, if you read it as the way ancients read history, which is effectively didactic. Like the point of studying history was didactic, to teach you something about yourself. If you're doing it honestly, it's still a transformative experience. And again, Plutarch doesn't speak about it directly, but he often talks about this passions, desire, which passions run which system effectively, or which character. And what I think is super important nowadays, and in different work you do, in different work I do, is to kind of bring this optic back. I think ultimate thing what I'm trying to do is to show exactly the movement of passions, desires, struggles, imitations at the realm of power. I think if more people learn to see what is happening around us in the same way, we'll build this true resilience and true subjectivity, which of course is not political in itself. It's not about rights. It's about conquering your own passions.
Yeah, conquering control.
With the grace, obviously, like as you know, because otherwise, like you will always fall into the same trap. You will always step on the same rakes, and you will be surprised how could it happen. Well, the same way it has happened to Rome, the same way this has happened late in like Florentine, the same way it has happened later. Let's say, because people don't change.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello, everyone. I'm Deacon Seraphim Rohlin. This is the Symbolic World. And I am joined today with Pavel Shchelin. Pavel is he is an Orthodox Christian. He is a political philosopher who is working within the realm of traditional political theology. Did I get that right, Pavel?
Tradition of political theology. As well.
Yeah, close enough. All right, so that's a pretty technical title, or pretty specific field of study for yourself. So could you just tell us a little bit? Obviously, you've got a YouTube channel, and Jonathan's been on your YouTube channel before. I've been on your YouTube channel before. This is your first time over here on the Symbolic World. But can you tell us about what it is that you're interested in? And we'll get into more specifics in a moment. But can you just kind of tell us what it is that you're interested in and what the overlap with our Symbolic World audience is?
Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, to explain in a nutshell, I would say that the political philosophy, generally, it's a part of philosophy which is concerned with the questions of power, broadly speaking, like policy and power comes hand into play. And in particular, why political theology? It's because political theology basically tries to understand how political phenomena, so the phenomena of power, have a religious or symbolical, I would say, underpinning behind them. So in that sense, the overlapping seems to be pretty clear. One of the downsides, one can say, or just things we take for granted in a modern world, is that the questions of religions and politics has to be separated. In case of America, you, for example, speak of the First Amendment, and people usually understand that it's like secularism means that the liberation from these universal patterns, universal thoughts, religious systems or belief systems when it comes to power decision. But that's not what is happening, like according to political theology. And for example, it showcases how the questions of power are still these same questions one can find in the scripture, the same questions one can find in different elements of holy writing, and basically showing the not just interconnection, but showcasing how without deep understanding of the universal language, I would argue, and how without deep understanding of how to speak, the landscape of religious thought, if it makes any sense, you can't truly understand what people of power are doing or pursuing. And it was actually much more difficult to talk about these questions like a couple years ago. Nowadays, when you have, like, say, a richest man of the, I will give you an example. You have one of the richest men on the planet Earth, Peter Thiel, giving series of lectures on apocalypses. Like recently, like it became pretty famous. And
Right.
it's not self-evident. It's not self-evident. Like, why would it be? Like, we were supposed to think that, like, it's completely separated. Why would he himself be pretty much concerned and occupied? Well, political theology, in fact, it's precisely searching for the question why. So, like, what desires, what motivation underpins certain type of political decisions, and showing how you can effectively build the ladder of these decisions back to the principle religious in nature structure, even if they are described in a secular language. For example, one can with passion defend the, like, for example, let's say environmentalism, but you can also show that this defense and this passion in itself cannot be understood if you don't recognize that it is done as if this is something holy. So something holy which needs to be defended. Like, for example, so it's not defended neutrally, let's say. It's defended precisely as something sacred. And basically, it's like showing the interplay between sacred and power. That's another way of, like, explaining what I try to show people.
What you just said reminds me of two things. One is the late great conservative English philosopher, Sir Roger Scruton. And something that Scruton says, he has a whole book about the environment in which he tries to make a case for a conservative environmentalism of what he expresses as ecophilia, that is the love of home, the love of the household. Like, you should love the place where you are, or, first and foremost, your village, your neighborhood, and then kind of growing out of that, your state, your province, your country, your culture, all those things. And that conserving the environment well would actually be a part of that love. The other thing that, as I was trying to think about how to boil down what you're saying, is that because you're right, the barriers have sort of broken down. I think that one way to think about it would be to say that certainly since the end of the Second World War, probably before that, but let's say since the end of the Second World War, there was a long-running consensus that, or this long-running idea that you could just sort of have religion over here in this bracket and politics over here in this bracket, and culture, myth, storytelling over here in this bracket, and that those things don't necessarily have to do anything with each other, So when somebody ends up bringing their religion into politics, you feel kind of icky, you feel kind of gross. It's like, hey, what are you doing bringing religion into this? Or, hey, what are you doing bringing politics into this? But in actuality, of course, if you know anything about the history of the world, all of those things have always, overlapped with each other, crossed over with each other. Like you said, you have one of the wealthiest people in the world are very interested in this biblical apocalypse imagery. They're also very interested in advancing certain political parties, right? So yeah, it's a very weird moment, and so I think that the insights that you'll have to give to our audience are going to be very helpful in terms of helping us understand more about kind of what's going on right at this moment. And I think there's even some recent things in the news that I'm hoping you'll help me understand as this conversation goes on. So part of the reason that you're here today, actually, I'll tell people the way that you and I met the first time was standing over by the book table and at the Symbolic World Summit 2 years ago in 2024. And I was talking to you, and you have, I'm sure you know this, kind of a quiet voice. I don't. I'm loud, which is bad sometimes, but good if you're a deacon. You have to sort of, got to beat the trumpet, right? But you have kind of a quiet voice. So I was bending over, straining to hear you talking, as something else was going on. We were being very rude. We weren't listening to the speakers. We were having a conversation, and I was just like craning to hear you talk. But I really sensed in that moment. First of all, I was like, yeah, this is somebody who has some really interesting, important, intelligent things to say. But also like, yeah, this is my kind of guy. I felt that way. And then I met Andrew, who works for you, and then it was like, okay, Andrew's really my kind of guy. Like long after you and Jonathan have gone to bed, Andrew and I will stay up, partying. But no, in any case, so I'm really happy that we're able to work with you. You've been helping us actually bring some of the Symbolic World courses to Russian language audience. And now we're excited to have you kind of return the favor. So you have a course that you've taught to multiple times to hundreds of students in Russian. And the course is on Plutarch's lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. And this is the course which we're going to be talking about today. We won't even so much be talking about the course, but this is the course that you're going to be doing for us. And my question for you would be something like, why Plutarch? I mean, I love old stuff. I love Plutarch. It's not hard to sell me. But why Plutarch? What does Plutarch have to say? What does he have to say to the situation that we're living in today? How similar or dissimilar are the times that we're living in? How has Plutarch helped inform your reading and understanding of history and politics? Another way to say this would just be, how does Plutarch reveal a sort of grammar of political symbolism to us?
Well, great questions, and hope to answer in a concise amount of time. So I will start with an observation. And I think this observation kind of shows the purpose of the course. In my work with the Russian audience, and later just talking to different people in English, I discovered or just embraced that maybe one of the most fundamental doxas or dogmas which we kind of share everyone without truly admitting or just even without even a need to admit it to ourselves, is that sounds something like this. History began with us, or with me in particular, something of this sort. So you mentioned it like Plutarch is something old, and if you consider, let's say, the stories he tells being something old, then obviously they have nothing to do with me because the real history only really started with me. That's why it has some of the positive elements. I will give the credit in sense that everything seems so new and exciting, but also it has the major negative, in my opinion, element. It's a certain stupidity, yes, I will be straightforward, and ignorance to the nature of, let's say, power relations, or the nature of state, the nature of war, the nature of political struggle, all things considered. Basically, for example, we are not really emotionally capable of dealing with any hardships. Like we immediately think that it should only be basically bigger and better, like progress without any crises.
Bigger and better, more prosperity. If the economy is not growing, we're doing something wrong. Do you know the show Parks and Rec? Did you ever see that show? Yeah, the character Ron Swanson, who's supposed to be like sort of a stereotypical, American,
libertarian, I would
specify. Yeah, libertarian. He gets to in one of the later seasons, he gets to the UK and he's standing there looking at Buckingham Palace, I think, and he says, or Downing Street, and he says, everything that history began in 1776. Everything before that was a mistake. And of course, that's a joke because it's such a stereotypical American view. But there is kind of, there's something to that. A lot of us really do kind of think and talk in that way.
I would even stress, like, as you said, it works as a joke in a show, but in my opinion, the truth is even darker. Because first, it's not American phenomenon. Unfortunately, I would specify it as a modern phenomenon, as the civilization of modernity. And then it is applicable to every person, no matter where he lives on the planet. To an extent, you accepted this modern thinking. I have a good friend, John Hirsch, called it basically the difference between new world and the old world. And I would say to an extent, you are a new world person. You do share this feeling one way or the other. Yes, you can maybe don't do it to such an extreme version as Ron Swanson did, or to such an extreme version as Fukuyama did, but like at least you can do it in a version, let's say, okay, all these history books, they're fun reading, like that's like somebody collects coins, somebody collects stamps, somebody likes to watch, I don't know, different stories, but ultimately it has nothing to do with the way the life is right here, right now. And this is a belief most people do share, like one way or the other. At least that's what I found. It actually doesn't matter to an extent whether you are a rich person, a poor person, like really comes across all structures of wealth and ages. Also, kind of akin to the things you do with symbolism, like it's just the fairy tales for kids, like very similar.
Yeah. That's how growing up as somebody who's really into history, that's basically how I was kind of treated, as like, oh, that's just his thing. And I always wanted to say, no, these stories are important. This stuff really matters. This is really beautiful. This is, this could change your life. But it's just sort of, it's like, okay, that's a fine hobby for you to have. Or we need to do a very quick survey of this in high school, and then it will never come up again in your life.
Yes. And later you discovered, and here comes why it matters. Later you discovered, and that's why like it gives me so much joy to work together, that stories do actually matter because we live in stories. And the stories you believe in and the stories you take for granted are exactly the stories through which you interact with the outside world. Here comes like one of the methodological, I would say, element of the course and answer to the question why Plutarch, because in Plutarch's life, the center of the story is a man, like the hero, if you want to put it this way. And we spent, in my opinion, too much time in the last, let's say, 200, 300 years trying to tell history as something purely, not even purely, like something objective, something like of a number, something like which, like these decisions were rational, or these decisions were made because of this, and this, and forces.
Economic pressure and so on.
Economic pressure, political reason, like the interest, etc. But in my opinion, nothing really changed from the time of Plutarch, with a certain caveat, but I might talk about it later. And the people who make decisions are still the same people. So the human heart, the human passion, the human, let's say, desire, we are still plagued by the same desires, by the same passions, by the same struggles than the heroes of Plutarch were. And then if you read it from this perspective, it's not the story about the past. It's the story, it is just a story, like more historical, like in the sense that it's kind of in between. So it's not completely mythos, like let's say a Cinderella story. But still, like if you look from a perspective of modern history, obviously Plutarch's lives don't meet the mark. Like no modern historians would seriously treat Plutarch as a historical source. Like where is his? It's one of my favorite jokes. Like the modern historian would spend like 200 pages out of 50 trying to give all of the sources for each archaeological evidence and which, like, let's say, particular letter to justify the minor minuscule claim he is trying to make. In Plutarch, you don't have it. He can basically do something like, and that's the exact speech this man gave. I don't have the source of the speech. I don't quote it anywhere. Like, you can only found it at me. But that's the exact speech one has given. And one can say, well, then it's not true. Like it's not what actually happened. Well, it depends how you read it. If you read it from the perspective, I want to know the exact facts that has ever happened, it might not be the most accurate, though then we run to the question, well, do you know any story which is accurate to such an extent in your life?
Well, to that, a a lot of times what people will say is like, well, if I'd been there with a video camera, but you can point out events. Some of them are happening in the United States right now, where there was a video camera present. In fact, there were multiple video cameras present, and something happened, and half the country looks at the event one way and half of it looks at it the other way. So this idea that sort of like if you just had the ability to record everything with a machine, that you're going to get this total objectivity is obviously false. What would you say about, before we get back to Plutarch, what would you have a response, or would you even care to respond to somebody who says, oh, that's just the great man view of history? Haven't we moved on from that? Any thoughts about that?
Oh, yeah. There is a lot to say about it. I will be upfront. I would answer this from Orthodox perspective.
Yeah.
And I think the paradox of Orthodox perspective that every man is a great man, potentially.
Potentially.
And from that, like in a way, more like we're all meant to be great men, from this perspective. So if you look and if you kind of reverse the table, then basically stories told from the great man perspective are still relevant to us, just on a different level of reality. Yes, maybe you yourself won't solve the problem of the state, but one of the things that course is trying to show people, you yourself still have to figure out political questions on the level of reality you're operating in. It can be the level of yourself, or it can be the level of your family. It can be the level of your company. It can be whatever you're working with. The politics, it's not about the scale. It has a certain element of the scale, but the scale is almost different. The politics is exactly about power. And the question of power is the first place we truly face it. Sorry for a pun. It's in front of the mirror. Do I have power over myself? Like, really, that's the first real question. And then the heroes of Plutarch are very relevant because they're struggling with these elements. And you can always ask yourself, like, you can recognize your own desires, you can recognize your own vulnerabilities, you can recognize your own passions in them. And then why it is a good story. It truly shows you the fruits, let's say, of certain desires. It shows that if being put into this particular, let's say, structure of reality, let's say republic, and then you actually look what republic is, for example, if you look into like what democracy is, some stuff like this, or which is, let's say, power distributed in a different way, or power like belonging to armed men, power belonging to popular men. Like, you can really quickly move it to pretty universal, let's say, first move it to universal level, and then bring it down to the level of universality, which is applicable to you, and then you can learn from it. That's, I think, is the most stories. So, as with any good story, you can learn, in my opinion, as much from a good history if it's written in a proper way. And here I do give a lot of credit to Plutarch because he writes it as a good stories. It's a good story of a man. You can see a person, and that's what we ultimately care about. That's why these patterns, it's patterns of men. It's patterns of their archetypes, not of some objective forces. And in that case, his stories, if you learn to read them, I do generally believe for people, if we learn to read history again and to understand history again, it will help us better understand ourselves. And that's a pretty good, I would say, task, generally speaking.
So,
and one thing, it has one downside. The modern realities really stop being that surprising to you. That's one downside of the course.
Yes,
I definitely have to give a credit for it. Like, it kind of becomes boring. So I would say for those who are expecting constantly to be excited about some urgent news, yes, the history really makes you a little bit decentralized for this.
So for people who don't know already, Plutarch's Lives, or the Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, is a collection of biographies. They're all relatively short. Obviously, Plutarch's Lives altogether is a kind of a hefty tome, but they are, by modern standards, each a relatively short biography. And it's is in pairs. So what Plutarch does is he takes one person from Greek history and one person from Roman history, and he tells their lives in parallels. And then very often, in I think 18 out of the 23 pairings, he follows it up with a short comparison of their lives together. Yeah, the short little commentaries sort of say, hey, here's some interesting ways. We're going to talk in a moment about Cicero. Here's some interesting ways that the life of Cicero and the life of, I think, Suetonius is the is that the Greek he parallels with him? I want to say no, it's not Suetonius. It's
no, because Suetonius is himself Roman.
Yes,
I actually don't remember.
Cicero, hold on. I'm just going to have to look at my notes here. I was trying to remember this. Oh, Demosthenes, of course. Yes, Suetonius is like, that's not right. All right, so anyway, so he pairs Cicero with Demosthenes, and so he does the life of Demosthenes, then the life of Cicero. Then he compares their life and says, hey, here's some interesting points about the way that they both really desired glory, and that kind of became problematic for them. Here's how they handled, at some point they each went into exile. So here's how they handled exile, and Cicero maybe did not handle exile so well. Whereas Demosthenes, that's when he actually becomes the best friend of his country, and so on. So that's what it is, and it's great reading. I mean, it's really fascinating. I find, obviously, this will not be a surprise to anybody at this point in time, but I find the lives of the lives of Plutarch to be just so fascinating. Of course, I love Roman history really, really deeply. Because it's awesome and interesting, and all the characters, especially from the late Republican period, are so they're so archetypical. They're so extroverted. You have to have somebody like Caesar and Cicero and Cato and Mark Antony, like all running around in proximity to each other, and Crassus at the same time in history. That's bonkers. And of course, it's also bears a lot of interesting similarities to the situation we find ourselves in today, which I think is something we're going to talk about. So, and I will just say, Plutarch went on to be hugely influential. For instance, Shakespeare's plays, especially Julius Caesar, Antony, and Cleopatra, drew heavily on Plutarch as a source. So Plutarch is directly responsible for a lot of the sort of the popular ways that we think about, some of these larger than life figures from that late Republican period.
Again, and I think I will stress the reason why, and that's where, and it's kind of hidden to me, in the text, because Plutarch never writes about it directly. So he if you read the text, he constantly spreads the snippets of this between his lines. He always tries to answer the question, what is the driving force, what is the main desire of our character, of our hero? Or if you speak, let's say, more symbolic, what telos, what principle does this hero serves? And that's why I think it's so important and relevant, and later for literature and for ourselves nowadays, because once we learn to see this connection between desire, or you can say service, then we can understand the action. So once we can understand the connection between desire and action, we can see the same connection no matter in which context it appears. And then we can separate between the context and this pattern itself. And in that case, it's very akin to the fairy tale, to the way it is done in the most classical stories. I just want to highlight it.
So let's take this grammar of symbolism that you've just given us, which is the question, whom does the hero serve? What's their telos? What's their principle? And then from whom they serve, we understand actions. From what their actions are, we can predict the decisions that they will make. Let's see how this plays out. If we can do an example real quick in the life of Cicero. So for people who are, I sure hope everybody out there who knows who Cicero is.
No, but
you'd like to think so.
Yeah,
but just to give a quick snippet, Cicero was born in 106 BC. He dies in 43. He is one of the novus homo, one of the new men. That is, he's from a new family, new blood, new money, no noble ancestry, but basically rises in the what are sometimes called the knights, Knights, but really the equestrian class, which is like the sort of it's not right to call them a middle class, but like they're not the old
Upper-
families of Rome, but they're
They're not
upper
old
class,
families, but they're upper middle class, but not an old
upper middle
money,
class,
kind of.
and these are land-owning families. These are land-owning families, and equestrian class, because like the knights of the later Middle Ages, they supply the cavalry when Rome goes to war. Okay, so he's from the equestrian class, and he basically rises entirely. I mean, he is a man of what at the time would have been considered to be very modest means for someone of his class, which of course means he only owns a few estates and just some slaves. You know, not he's not like Crassus or Julius Caesar, right? Although Caesar was quite poor for most of his early life, but that's a different life. So, but he rises through oratorical brilliance. He is a brilliant speaker. He is a brilliant jurist. He gets most of his early cred, as a lot of Roman politicians did, by basically being a lawyer. Again, kind of setting the path, the precedent for the way that our society works. And his identity is very much bound up with the Republic's constitutional machinery, which is there's not a written constitution like we have today, but rather there's a series of kind of binding legal precedents that have built on each other for generations and generations and generations. All these things that the Romans constructed after they drove out the Tarquins, the last of their kings, all these various apparatus, some of which were legal, some of which were religious, but actually all religious things are legal and all legal things are religious if you're a Roman. And
very political, theological comment, saying. Perfect.
Yeah, so they have all these apparatus that they built to basically kind of control and constrain power and make sure that one person doesn't gather too much power to themselves. And so he knows that machinery inside and out. And this is a world in which being able to debate well in the Senate, being able to get your point across in a convincing and powerful way is kind of the most important skill there is. And so in 63 BC, he is elected consul, which is sort of like being elected president / commander-in-chief. And this is as high as you can get. This is, as top of the pile. And during this time, during his consulship, there was something called the Catiline conspiracy, which is both his finest hour and also this very fatal precedent. So I don't know do you want me to say more about the Catiline conspiracy, or do you want to just kind of go from there?
No, I think it's, again, I hope people will just read, like, honestly after it, but basically it is a very interesting story.
Go Wikipedia Cicero, you guys.
Go at least just Wikipedia,
whatever.
Because the context is important. He does the conspiracy. I guess we can walk it along the same line. We can just move it forward. I think that a couple interesting things about what you said before and how it is all, again, relevant to modern days. I would say Cicero is a new man in a way more meaning than one can say, like one can think. So because his thinking is actually pretty modern. You mentioned before his talent of rhetoric, right? Or basically in rhetoric. Like, so he's famous for giving speeches. If anything, like, his legacy is mostly in like textbooks effectively nowadays, how to speak well, how to build an argument well. And then for hundreds of years, even like way after the Republic has fallen, Cicero's speeches actually stayed as a part of the core curriculum for like Middle Ages and like actually both like in the West and in the East. Like, so his legacy of very eloquent person has stayed with us.
I will say, as a Latinist, Cicero's Latin is the golden age of Latin. Like, he's the bar. And of course, he writes a lot of poetry, which much of which is technically brilliant, but thematically is kind of not my favorite Latin poetry. And then, but then there's also he also writes some beautiful treatises, including one on friendship, which I think is goes on to be one of the most beloved texts of the Middle Ages.
Yes. However, there are very close to hard points in his early ages. So the first thing is pretty good. In contrast to many people, he is talented from a very young age, and he's pretty clear what he's going to do with his life from a very young age. So, like, even when he was a kid, basically, he interesting about the spirit in Roman life, him being very basically clever in school made him popular. To an extent, it actually caused some, at first, anger from the sides of the more richer families because their kids were hanging with Cicero and looking up to him, which is like a little bit, status clash, but says a lot about the time. However, later in his life, it was a very interesting episode in one of his travels or exiles when he visits the philosophical school, like in essence, and actually criticizes how Plutarch writes the changes in the teaching, whatever. Like he doesn't really distinguishes what it is, but you can look more and basically what the conflict was. The classic conflict of a law is like, what is the truth? And basically back then there were two schools. One is like effectively narrowing it down that the truth is something objective. So, and like that would be that pursuing the truth as a search of something real is how you win the case. And then there was a second school when effectively truth is something you can prove in court. So how beautiful your line of arguments is.
The sort of the classic, scummy lawyer kind of, the truth is whatever I make you believe it is kind of.
Yes. And Cicero definitely was of the second opinion in his professional career from the very beginning. And for him, it was actually why I do stress it out, because for him, it was almost a rational choice. So he clearly was a very smart man. He was exposed to both traditions, and he being a lawyer in the late Republic, you can clearly see why he was like this second opinion was way more closer to his heart, especially if later we talk about the passion which he truly had in his heart. But why I already mentioned earlier he's a very modern man, because let's be honest, that is a very modern statement. Truth is whatever I make out of it. It's one of the core statements most politicians, and unfortunately we ourselves, kind of tend to have nowadays. Like, it's not something old. Like, that belief is pretty close. And in that sense, the life of Cicero is becoming very close to our age, because what it shows, in my opinion, what happens to a man who is undoubtedly super talented, but has truly no spiritual core in the game of power. That's what is the story of Cicero, in my opinion, is about. And then you can come basically to the whole Catiline conspiracy, because that's where I think it started to shine very brightly. In the moment of his triumph, basically, I won't go into detail what it was, but basically, yes, there was a conspiracy, another in Rome. Back then, way not the first. Like, so back then, Rome was a pretty vulnerable state, and it's very interesting, like, why. Some parallels about upper class behavior, which Plutarch describes also, ring very close, including that they kind of end up spending most of the money on entertainment, like some of the nobility. And basically, as the state became very, how Plutarch has like shaky, and any arrogant man could have pushed it with the littlest of effort. It's almost a direct quote, which also, it seems to be quite a long time ago, but not saying, but again, pretty close. But long story short, Cicero manages to prevent the conspiracy, and it's important how. Like, he prevents it not from decisive military action, but effectively from talking, from speaking. And that's why kind of this whole story looks to be exactly the pinnacle of Republican politics. We didn't even have to, let's say, resolve to force. Like, we solved it effectively through speech. But then comes a very big problem. After the conspiracy, Cicero found himself in a position he wasn't ready to. He needed ultimately to decide what to do with the people he arrested. And logically, reasonably, he needed to execute them. Obviously, state conspiracy. However, emotionally, he could not do it, because then it would lead to other negative consequences, let's say, potentially. And here we come, I think, to the essence of power. like in this story, because what power is, like when it comes to politics, it's not making the most rational decisions. It's about making ultimate decisions about life and death. It's ultimate decision and ultimate responsibility for these decisions when one cannot get a guarantee. One cannot get, I cannot make a rational calculation which proves that like this decision will end up to my benefit. No. Ultimate decisions, and power is always about ultimate decision, whether it's power over your family, power over yourself, power over your company, requires spiritual foundation. Without a spiritual foundation, you cannot make this, you won't call it leap of faith, but basically you cannot make a decision which doesn't have a clear-cut answer that it will be good in the moment. Like it might be, the consequences might be hard, but it is transcendent. Cicero cannot make the decisions. And in his whole life and his whole story, this pattern starts to repeat itself. Later in his life, he leaves great quote, which I think is basically something modern man can always subscribe completely. Like, from whom to flee is clear, but not to whom. Like it's when there was later conflict between Caesar and Pompey, and he didn't know whom to support. But again, because he could build, as a lawyer, he can build a very persuasive case that why one should defend Pompey. And the other story, I can build very persuasive case why to support Caesar. Why to execute, why not to execute, why to marry, why not to marry, why to sell my company, why not to sell my company, life and death of a company. Let's say, why do this and this? So actually, we as modern people, and nowadays, especially with the help of AI, can ask AI to build you gigantic lists of for and against. Problem is about how to choose between them. And exactly to choose, you need to have a very different quality in yourself than the competence. You need to have faith. Well, faith was exactly what Cicero didn't have.
So Cicero, of course, does execute the conspirators. Yeah. And if I'm remembering correctly, he has this sort of there's this long deliberation in the Senate. Cicero should be making a decision about this, kind of fails to do so. And as a result, things are getting worse and worse. So the conspirators are starting to like militarize the gangs of Rome and militarize their supporters. And so now we're in danger of losing the city all over again. And so what Cicero does, finally, Plutarch says he's long in deliberation with himself and with his friends, hesitating whether he should put them to death. And then finally, he decides to. But the way that he does it is very important, right? Because he has them executed without a trial, which is at that moment is the expedient and necessary thing to do. Probably saved Rome. Certainly, that's what people thought at the moment. He's hailed as father of his country. I think the first person ever.
Yes, it's very ironic that he is the first person who received the title, which later became a part of imperial title.
Yeah, that's right.
It is very ironic.
So he's hailed as father of his country, but this action is also the one that will come back to get Cicero later, because it is, of course, an unconstitutional act. So as soon as he's not in power, as soon as he's got enemies, then it becomes possible to prosecute him for that action, because he had Roman citizens executed without a trial. Right.
Yes. It's in the long run, yes, this decision really beat him, but more than that, it beat. I think one needs to understand that not from constitutional perspective, but from a personal perspective, what beat Cicero more, which again, coming back to the way, in my opinion, Plutarch shines very brightly, is the character. So, because there is another element in Cicero which feels very close to home. If you remember, most part of his life, he actually is playing games with himself and with the public, because he kind of imitates being a statesman. That's what is very important. He constantly does this game. Well, it's such a burden to be a statesman. I would rather be a philosopher. I would rather go far away. And in his life, he does it several times. He runs away, then comes back, then runs away, then comes back. And it is very important that, like, when he comes back, he constantly looking, do you still remember me? Do you still, basically, do you still like me? He, despite being at the pinnacle of Rome, despite being like saying that he's a philosopher who is above this measly wordy, let's say, desires, Plutarch actually writes, but above all else, his heart was plagued by the passion for human
glory.
praise. For glory, specifically in form of praise, because that's what Lives of Plutarch are so beautiful at. You can you can definitely see different shades of glory. Let's say both Pompeius, both Caesar, both Cicero, they all kind of, Plutarch writes, wanted glory, but it's very different glories all of them wanted.
Isn't that so interesting? Because you're totally right. For Cato, there's also a kind of glory, and he gets that he gets that glory, that place in Roman history where even his enemies respect him. The quote I've got it right here. It says he was always excessively pleased with his own praise and continued to be very greedy of that glory to the end.
And it went to an extent, remember, this Catiline conspiracy, like, it also sounds very close to home. Like, basically, he became, with this story, like a man who won a football championship in a high school, and then started telling the story when he's like 50. He managed to literally bore everyone with it.
I remember that he started, I don't remember if he finished, but he started writing an epic poem about himself. And the way that he saved the country, and that for a while there, like, you couldn't be like in the elevator with Cicero, because he'd be like, "Oh, as long as I have you for 2 minutes, let me read you some of this epic poem I wrote about myself." Just like really, really kind of difficult to live with.
But exactly, you can see why it is almost inevitable. So no man can truly live without the foundation. And basically, what Cicero inadvertently has done, he made himself a hostage of the public praise, the public opinion, the public desire, while claiming to be a philosopher who is above this and who serves the beauty, who serves the rhetoric, who serves the truth to an extent. He understands, though, like, again, he had a very complicated relationship with this concept, but again, looking close to home, and isn't it what we're seeing right now? We see so many, let's say, politicians. If anything, that's Cicero's. We are full of them. We have people with this beautiful degree. Okay, maybe less talented in rhetoric, actually, than him. But the pattern is more or less the same. They're all pretty good equivalent of a great degree. They're capable of doing certain level of speeches among the crowds. Like, they're really loving the sound of their own voices.
Yeah.
But when it comes to ultimate decision, which requires a sacrifice, the best they can do is hesitate. Maybe they will do it, but they will do it either too late or wrongly. They will imitate, and ultimately they will postpone an ultimate decision to an extent, like any decision they make is bad, like is a bad decision. And while being constantly while constantly buffooning about their past achievements, real or imaginary. So, and in that case, we are completely, let's say, surrounded by exactly Cicero's. Like, he's a very modern concept. He's kind of postmodernist to an extent, like, because his lack of faith makes him trapped in the echoes of public opinion. It makes him trapped in the echoes of his own voice, and later it leads to his demise. I will highlight that the two reasons he actually ends up dying, like, it's a little bit skipping, but just to give a clue. So first, he became completely, unhinged, like, quote, with one particular man, Mark Antony, like, who is not the smartest man, I will give it to this, but he is a really strong and powerful man in Rome after Caesar's death. So we're a little bit skipping around the time, but again, read the Wikipedia article. Like, it's important, like, for story part, it's just important that basically at the end of his life, Cicero manages to really make Mark Antony obsessed with the desire to kill him for no real good reason. And Plutarch actually writes about it, that it was kind of for no good reason. So rhetoric is a weapon which you can use something like diligently. But in case of Mark Antony, Cicero was doing it just because he can, because he kind of enjoyed it, mocking again with the rhetorical. Basically, it's like sharp tweets, like giving the bad nicknames and writing very sharp tweets about Mark Antony for like several years. And one needs to understand, Mark Antony was a man capable of pretty rash humor against himself.
Right.
Plutarch writes about it in the life of Mark Antony. So, if anything, in his personal life, when people were around him, mocking him in a good environment could actually give you some points. Speaking about our Mark Antony. So, you can imagine how hard one must to try to make such a man so determined to kill you, like for no good reason.
Because even though between Pompey and Caesar, Cicero sides with Pompey, which you know, it doesn't go well. But then what happens is that Caesar likes Cicero personally, which has always been interesting to me because they're so different. But Caesar likes Cicero personally, and he sees having Cicero around kind of gives him the cachet. Like Caesar is very much, we're going to talk about words and commands in a moment. Caesar is very much a commands guy, but he also has enough kind of like aristocratic sensibilities that he realizes, hey, keeping somebody like Cicero around as ornamentation, that's going to be good for me. That's going to legitimize what I'm trying to do, is I take all of these disparate pieces of power that used to belong to the kings that were split up between the tribunes and the consuls and the senate and so on, and actually try to bring them back together into one person. The problem is that they kill Caesar for doing that, and the next guy who comes along, who's Mark Antony, obviously you've got the second triumvirate, but the next guy who comes along doesn't care about any of that stuff. And he does not care about looking legitimate. He doesn't care about playing the games. Like, you know, Cicero's very good at playing the game. But what happens when somebody comes along who doesn't care about playing the game? They just want to do what they want to do, and they have the power to do it.
And you still kind of insulting them just because you personally dislike them. Like, and that's effectively what Cicero did. Like, which is so ironic for such a smart man who was kind of digging his own grave with it. Like, and it is also interesting, a small detail here again about the ultimate decisions, because when there was a conspiracy against the Caesar, it is Plutarch also has a very interesting lie that Cicero was not involved in it because he kind of didn't got invited because nobody trusted him actually to be capable of doing anything, which is also very like ironic. I would put it this way.
That's right.
So yes, he was very flowery embellishment kind of this political theater, who definitely thought very much about himself. That's a very important part. Like, I don't know, like not saying names, but definitely Cicero really like thought himself being actually the smartest guy in the room all of the time, and not in the nice way, especially the older he got. Like, this is also a very interesting part about the life of Plutarch. You can see how certain seeds which were planted in a very young age later bloomed like into different consequences, because younger Cicero looks much more appealing, let me put it this way, than the older Cicero. Like, the older Cicero, the way Plutarch describes him, it's way more and more, I'm sorry, pathetic man who just, reminiscence about the glory of his highest moment, who is not careful with his words, who kinda lies to himself. I think that's, again, very important point, because even his friends were tired of him constantly like, I just wanted to be a philosopher, or I'm so tired of this political struggle. But he can't, because if he truly becomes a philosopher, you need to sacrifice a lot for this truth. Let's say sorry for my pronunciation, like Diogenes. Like there were many, especially in Greek environments, there were many philosophers who kind of dropped everything, effectively became a version of a monk. Some of them legitimately started a school and occupied themselves just with basically teaching young kids rhetoric. But Cicero, it was not good enough for Cicero. In his life, he got like 3 times an opportunity to completely go away from it, to just stay as one would say, the rector of a very prestigious university, but it was never enough for him. Like, it was never enough for him. He always wanted to come back, but also in a way, like, that it didn't look like he wants power. That's a very interesting story. He wanted the glory of power, one can say, the glory of being on top without carrying the duty of being on top, which something we do all the time. And well, eventually it has beaten him pretty badly. Like I think it's exactly the final part of his life when this, as you said, effectively it already starts right after Caesar. So effectively after this whole Catiline conspiracy, Cicero life goes down the hill. You already mentioned struggle of Pompeius and Caesar, but then basically first Caesar wins over Pompeius, then Caesar getting killed, and then there is a time of the second triumvirate with 2 key characters like Mark Antony and Octavian the August, and the time has changed. By the time has changed radically, like in Rome,
and the power has also just passed into the hands of younger men. Quite frankly, because Cicero was from the generation, like he was a young man in the army under Sulla, so he saw the first really big civil war and the first dictator, and he saw the first like what power and glory could look like, and how you could do this extreme thing to save the city, to save the republic. And then he always has that in mind, like that's the guy he's going to be. But of course he's no Sulla. And in fact, somebody like Mark Antony or Octavius, much closer to Sulla in terms of well, at least in terms of spine, if not morals.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, some of them, yes. Again, and we need to know that Sulla was not really a noble man. If you look into his story with his whole system of proscriptions, just saying.
Yeah.
Sulla was capable of making really harsh decisions, often for bad reasons, but he definitely didn't lack the opportunity to make the decisions. Cicero would not be able to do it. Like, that's important. Yeah. But yes, as you said about younger men, it's also interesting that this younger man believed in something. Again, Octavian
maybe
more
the wrong
than
thing,
Antony. But they definitely were not this postmodernist bureaucrat at the ancient Rome, because there is a very precise quote about Cicero life, which I think we all need to remember, that Cicero ended up dying, and we will talk about it later, as he lived, believing words matter enough to be dangerous. And here is the problem. Words alone are not dangerous. It's about the will to cross the Rubicon. If in the let's say in the ancient Rome time, it's when a word is connected to a will, and this is a very theological statement. If you think about it, it's not just the word. I think that's the main difference people don't understand, because you can fall into 2 degrees. Like, words don't matter at all. Let's say radical materialism, or it's like just flattering mumbo jumbos. Stories don't matter at all. And the second is like stories matter on their own alone. Well, I think Cicero life also shows what happens when you fall into the second danger, when effectively you separate words from will to live your own word. And
it's so easy for academics, especially like in postmodern academics, to get hung up about this idea, like, and we can fall a little bit in love with words and our own words and our own rhetorical brilliance and our own ability to say things, and you suddenly sort of forget that no lives are actually being changed by, you go to the conferences and you give the talks and you hear other people give the talks and you get your journal articles published and all these different things. And for the most part, very little of it actually matters. What matters is the people who have the will to implement the things. And sometimes when you see the things that you're talking about implemented by the people who have the will, it's real ugly.
Yes, it is very ugly, because it's exactly about this yes, we as Christians talk about God's word, but in that case, this word is perfectly united with will, is perfectly united with sacrifice, it's perfectly united with action, and it's about the combination of all things. Cicero was effectively a man of empty words, the best possible language of empty words. That's why his rhetoric argument, his rhetoric textbooks state. But in terms of political struggle, most of his words end up being empty. Yes, he could destroy reputation all over time, but ultimately, if you look deep into his life, he is a man who thinks he will use everyone around him and ends up being used by every true political power around him. As you mentioned Caesar before he was, let's say, even in Catilina conspiracy, effectively, he was not effectively a political actor. He was effectively used by oligarchical senate to, suppress the populist kind of uprising. Just, again, a little bit simplifying it, but kind of effectively what have happened. And at the end of his life, that's the most paradoxical part. He ends up being outplayed in his own game, in his own, let's say, usage game by Octavian. Because the story is like this young guy, Octavian, who is heir of Caesar, but he's in a moment political state is not that stable, because actually people are afraid that he will become too dangerous and too powerful. And then he uses the Caesar, saying, I will just basically rule together with you, and you will actually carry the most duty. Basically, he plays his arrogance part, and then Caesar uses all of the rhetorical power he is left with, all of the talent he is left with, to persuade that Octavian is basically our new salvation. Like everyone wants Octavian, so, something of this sort. He used all of it. The crisis for Octavian passes away, and Cicero loses kind of everything. Like he never played.
Cicero sort of makes this gamble on his words, right? This is from Plutarch. He says, Cicero, who perceived his object, that is, Octavian, did all he could by the speeches he made in the Senate and among the people to bring the things to the issue that Octavian desired. Because Cicero thinks that he's using Octavian to get what he wants. And he said, again, this is from Plutarch, is supposed to have made a quip about Octavian and said, this young man is to be praised, honored, and got rid of. And of course, Octavian overhears this and does not forget about it.
No, and more importantly, Octavian is absolute opposite. Octavian, just as a spoiler, Octavian is, in my opinion, later. Unfortunately, Plutarch never left us a life of Octavian, so you have to read it in Suetonius. But basically, Octavian is absolute power. Like, if there is an image of a man of power, it is definitely Octavian. And it's just very ironic to see how basically Cicero gets completely crushed, sacrificed later by Octavian as a pawn, with traded well. Octavian, it's interesting. It's not like Octavian really wanted to do it, but if left with no other choice, he had no problems doing it. But to me, just coming back to the story, it's even more interesting. If you remember, Plutarch writes why Cicero has fallen into this trap. And it's again so close. Basically, because he had a dream. This man who is so proud of his reason, one can say, is so proud of his rhetoric, who is above all of this, let's say, village people belief system. Because it's a fun fact that Cicero was head priest of Rome, and he could not even say that whether gods exist or not.
Yes.
I literally heard Archbishop of Canterbury last year say something like this. In England, said, I'm truly not sure whether the God exists, but I think it's still good. But Cicero, something of this sort. So, and this man who should be so much elevated, so much above, basically falls into the trap, which costs him his life, because he saw a dream. Basically, something along the lines that his duty is to raise the young eagle and rule over them. So there is this dream about the thunder, an eagle, the sacrifice. He consults like a mystic, effectively, which, as you can see all over LA, and he ends up falling with this plan, no matter what other, maybe even rational calculations would have told him. And again, it's very for you as a deacon, you can definitely see it playing all of the times that people who claim to be that we are as a man of reason often end up being quite manipulated by the most pagan forces and pagan desires in their hearts and falling into the traps which end up cost them everything. I want precisely to highlight that in case of Rome, it's not was that uncommon. Many Roman men, basically treated face something of this sort. Like basically, it's something which we don't treat too seriously, but it's important part of social fabric, social structure. So that's why we uphold it. But in personal life, in many stories, you can see how the men are often guided and manipulated by the most absurd dreams, stories, priestesses, some kind of very, I would say for modern Americans, the closest I've seen some very LA vibe. I don't know if you ever driven
No, that's right, because there's like the established imperial or another time the established cults of the city, like the Vesta and so on, and Capitoline Jupiter. But then what the aristocracy go for are like mystery cults and things that are kind of sensational, things that are kind of mystical, like stuff like that. It's people are people everywhere, man. That's always my takeaways. People are people everywhere.
And that is the main story. That's why the history is so important, because people are people everywhere. You find yourself surprisingly not alone. You can always, for example, if you know the stories and histories very well, you can always see what happens when an empty word meets command suddenly. When, let's say, a desire of somebody to take some piece of land cannot be stopped by just the phrase like, we have let's basically have these principles and the capacity to stay by these principles if it's just a mega word. And I'm quoting recent speeches given in Davos, effectively. Just, again, I don't kind of want to... As I told you, basically, Cicero's is something which it's this pattern of man, as I said, is a very postmodern man. And I don't know if you had experience. One of my educations is from Europe, and I'm bet in elite American universities something of similar has been happening. So effectively, modern university is designed to breed Ciceros of different caliber of talent. One can be like Barack Obama, very talented, very eloquent. One can be less talented, or doesn't matter. But essentially, if we look at on all of them from the lenses we discussed in the life of Cicero, we see this principal parallels. Not lack of true belief in anything, like any higher purpose, any higher reality, any true God above them. Exceptional, extraordinarily love to the sound of their own voices, and effectively this belief in being the chosen. Because what Cicero effectively did, he believes that I'm the chosen one, and everybody should applaud me, everybody should love me, I deserve all of the praise, etc. Appeals that you can achieve it effectively by rhetoric alone. You can see it, for example, in the context of war. Many people, over the course of the last decades, effectively think it's enough just to say the right phrases. We just need to keep making chants about reality, and this will happen. And this will happen. I'm not even saying which decision is right. I'm saying that the belief that chanting the decision, chanting the right words will result into the right outcome, it's a very modern governmental apparatus vibe of thinking. In America, it was more internally, I would say, but in Europe, it was both internally and externally, in terms of administration. We just need to say that economy is going better, or we just need to say that this is this and this is happening, and this will happen. Empty words. Yeah. And then every time these people are faced with the need to make a sacrifice, with the need to make an ultimate decision, they pause. They are not capable of it, or the best they can do, make a half decision, kick the can down the road, say something right without truly committing to it, which results in situation going worse and worse. Basically, I would say they are lacking supra-rational motivation to truly exercise political power.
Yeah. That's a great way to put that.
I mean, yeah. And then what is happening, and that's why it's happening, like as well as in the life of Cicero, when they are faced with pretty brutal, pretty arrogant, pretty even maybe not correct in its own right. I'm not saying, like, for example, Antony was correct or Caesar was correct. It takes a whole different conversation. But simply with the ability to exercise decisions, to exercise commands, and to follow up your decision, no matter how barbaric they are, they have to step back. And all of the flourish of their language starts looking very pathetic. They start saying one thing in private and another thing in public. They start being so strong and powerful and talking about the glory of Europe, and then in private, let's say, basically, please don't do this, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
Like what is happening all over Greenland right now. Basically, that is the story. Like the conflict between Trump and Europeans can clearly be seen as a certain parallel between, let's say, general pattern of Cicero and any desire to make and any power, just an ability to exercise a command. We've seen it before recently, for example, when power fall in Syria, like pretty barbaric people, and I'm not saying it as a compliment, but like pretty ruthless, as we've seen later on the tragedies which happened even to many Christian communities. But you cannot stop the force by mere words. You need this passion. You need this, and you need something strong. You need the sacrifice to stop something bad which is coming your way. If all you have to offer is just words, you will lose. You will lose in your personal life. When you're fighting sin, you will lose in your family. You will lose in your corporation. You can be 100% right. You can speak 100 words 100%, 100 times. If you're not ready to follow up on it, your opponent, your competition will win over you, even if they, truth be told, are worse than you, like in many ways. But they will win, because power is not about words alone. And that's, I think, is the lesson which Cicero teaches us with his life, literally, and in terms of literally and symbolically, in terms of the Plutarch's description.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So, can you tell us about the course itself? Just the kind of what we're going to be covering, how many weeks it is, who we'll be looking at, and what people can expect. This will be it's a bigger course than we've ever done before. So just to help give people a sense of what to expect.
Well, it's a shorter version of what I do in Russian, but yes. So basically, what we're gonna do, we will have total 8 meetings, and they are divided into 2 parts, effectively. So there are first 3 meetings when we read 3 Greek lives. It's Lycurgus, it's Alcibiades, and it's Lysander, like from Plutarch. So like 3 interesting stories. So the first is the story, I would say, of again, you can read the description, but ultimately the first is about how to build so what drives in the heart of a political community. The second is about what is like the tragedy, I would say the deserved tragedy of democratic system, and we can actually see what how Plutarch writes about the pinnacle of the story of democracy in ancient lives. And we will talk about how democracy is different from the republic, like all of these elements in it, what passions are driven by people in this system. Then in Lysander, we will talk about how victory can be turned into defeat, which is very modern story. Surprisingly, it's much harder to deal with your own victory than even for yourself, but also for a community, for company, for your family. Success kills often way more quicker than the tactical defeat, and kind of the story of Lysander is about it. And then we're having, and this is kind of the stories which I teach. So there is a presentation, I give a talk once a week on these 3 topics, and then we're having a colloquium. So on each of the topics, and that's a very important part. Yeah, now maybe the sales go down, but I have to say, we expect our participants to write an essay, because the true purpose of the course is not to listen to a big head talking in your screen. The ideal purpose is that, and as you know, like all stories, all lives of Plutarch are great. So what the class is for is to give a taste of it, to learn to a little bit for some people to learn to read again, because yes, I know you said they're pretty short, but for many people over the course of the previous years, reading anything longer than 2 pages became a challenge in itself. So that's a good exercise to start doing this deep reading and to trying to understand what you have read. Basically, at the end of for each lecture, a participant writes a small essay. It doesn't have to be big. It's not professional. It's not graded or anything. The purpose is to build in yourself this capacity to connect the story with some universal political power pattern which you have witnessed in culture, in your life, in your family, in your company, in different parts of history, in different histories, or in modern, say, political environment. So then, after 3 classes, we have you can call it a round table, basically. I read some of the questions, I answer some of the questions from the essay. People can ask me questions. So basically there is this interactive element involved. So that's the force. And then kind of this repeats itself, but on the Roman material. So we have another 3 lives, but now the Roman lives, and it's exactly all lives are from the age of collapsing republic. So the same age we are talking about with Cicero, and it's about, I think, Pompeius, it's Caesar, and it's Octavian, and basically it's about trying to understand which desires lead to which outcome when ultimate price of power is at stake, which is pretty close to what American political life is right now.
Pretty much.
And then another round table, effectively. So that's the course in the nutshell. And hopefully by the end of it, at least just saying that's speaking from the experience, and that's why I think this collaboration might bring good fruits. People start seeing it, and I can definitely see people start, at least by then, stop treating history as something alien. They start seeing it as something they live in, not something that began with them, but something that they live in. And start seeing these patterns, and then go on reading further stories of Plutarch, of different other historians, from the perspective not to learn something about the past, but to learn something about ourselves. And that, I think, is the main goal. And I hope we will be able to work towards it.
So one of the questions I am often asked is when I talk about history, I get to the end and I'm connecting, St. Brendan and the mermaid and Charlemagne or whatever, I'm talking about history. I get to the end and people will say, okay, great, but how does this, usually they ask it okay, but how does that apply to America? That's where we're all concerned about. How does this apply to us? And right now I'm doing some stuff on American symbolism, the symbolism of American history, in particular religious history, and it's probably the most upset I've ever made anybody with that series of videos. Just in terms of the comments section, because now it gets personal when the nice thing about studying some of this stuff that happened a long time ago. Is that you have enough distance, you're removed far enough away from it that you can apply it in a way that's going to be less painful, I think. So
well, for some people, yes, but I have to tell you, it can be also pretty, you can say that, you can look at it this way. History is a mirror. If you treat history from a modern science perspective, then yes, you can definitely keep this impassionate element. Let's say, if you read it as the way ancients read history, which is effectively didactic. The point of studying history was didactic, to teach you something about yourself. If you're doing it honestly, it's still pretty transformative experience, I would put it. I would put it along this line, as any good piece of, as any good story. But I agree, it's less painful than, let's say, just facing it, not even facing it directly, but reading the news. And I would add still, there is one difference between modern and ancient time. It's still much nicer to read histories because in a certain way, they were bigger people. We are way too similar to them in terms of our vices, but we definitely like a lot in terms of their virtues. And in that sense, it's much nicer stories.
Let's talk a little bit about contemporary parallels.
There was a story in Russia, that all these things we talked about kind of just punked me onto the head. It was the story of this Prigozhin uprising. So basically, there was this mercenary company which kind of rebelled and tried to achieve some.
I remember that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So so the story went, and then I was exactly reading Plutarch as the life of Guy Marius, and it really hit me how the motivation, the desire, the passion, even the words in which Plutarch describes the story corresponds with what's happening on the screen, and it was just fascinating.
I don't know if you remember the Tea Party in American
I remember the Tea
politics
Party.
About a decade ago. So I was reading a ton of Roman history right around that time. And I looked at, at this one moment we had the Tea Party, was it 2012? We had the Tea Party and the Occupy movement both happening at the same time. And it was like the kickoff of eventually the Tea Party morphs into MAGA and everything. And the Occupy movement morphs into BLM. But you had this moment of just populist uprising on the left and on the right, and I was like, we're in our Gracchi brothers moment. Yeah, we're in the Titus Gracchus moment. Like that is what is happening right now. And so set your watches. A Caesar's going to come along.
Caesar's is going to come along, and that is the most fascinating because we. Again, Plutarch doesn't speak about it directly. That's why I still think the reason that value of kind of translating and showing and putting a spotlight. Yeah. But he often talks about this passions, desire, the system, which passions run which system effectively, or which character. And what I think is super important nowadays, and in different work you do, in different work I do, is to kind of brings this optic back, because there is one tradition of, I didn't go deep into it, but there is different traditions of political theology, and I, truth be told, using this term just to be able to find any label to what I'm doing. Yeah. But what I am trying, I think, ultimately, what I'm trying to do is to show exactly the movement of passions, desires, struggles, imitations at the realm of power. And if more people learn to see what is happening around us in the same way, we actually will build this true resilience and true subjectivity, which of course is not political in itself. It's not about rights. It's about this right over the passion, or not right, the conquering your own passions.
Yeah, conquering, control.
With the grace, obviously, as you know, because otherwise, you will always fall into the same trap. You will always step on the same rakes, and you will be surprised how could it happen. Well, the same way it has happened to Rome, the same way this has happened late in Florentine, the same way it has happened later. Let's say, because people don't change. The same passions put into the same context with the same desires will give more or less the same result. Yes, it will look slightly differently, but in essence, it will be the same. And it's I was told the joke, being a confessor in one way, it's the most boring job because people are confessing the same thing over and over again.
That's right. This is going to be the longest course we've ever done, folks. Yeah. The course is $180. I'm really excited about it. I am the guy who spends every day thinking about the Roman Empire. Hi, it's me. So if that describes you as well, please come and join me. Learning from Pavel and learning about how to view history as a mirror. I think this is going to be a wonderful supplement to the things that we've been covering in terms of universal history on the symbolic world. So I'm very, very excited about it. I hope that you are as well. Pavel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I said I would never do it again, but here we are. We are announcing the Symbolic World Summit in May 2026. I have so many great people around me that I'm just excited to do it, even though I thought it would be crazy to do it again.
Our summit's going to be from May 14th through 16th in Broadview Heights, Ohio. You can buy tickets at symbolicworldsummit.com. We have early bird pricing going right now, $50 off of general admission and VIP tickets. Keynote speakers this year are Father Josiah Trenum and Dr. Mary Harrington, which is a combination nobody knew that they wanted, but I think is going to be absolutely incredible. And of course, Jonathan and I will be speaking as well as several people from around the Symbolic World community.
A lot of people that you like, that you've seen, are going to be there, are going to come. We're going to have book signings. It'll be a lot of time for people to meet and to greet. We're also doing Supra as well. And so come and join us. We can't wait for this, and we're excited to meet you in person.